that we might make. And now we have a senator suggesting that our Secretary of State is purposely misinterpreting the deal and giving the supreme leader of Iran the benefit of the doubt in the interpretations. You know, that's not how we're supposed to run foreign policy, regardless of who's president or Secretary of State. We can have arguments, and they're legitimate arguments to be had. I understand why people might be mistrustful of Iran. I understand why people might oppose the deal, although the reason is not because this is a bad deal per se, but they just don't trust any deal with Iran and may prefer to take a military approach to it. But when you start getting to the point where you are actively communicating that the United States government and our Secretary of State is somehow spinning presentations in a negotiation with a foreign power, particularly one that you say is your enemy, that's a problem. It needs to stop. Jim Acosta. Oh, I'm sorry. Where's Jim?
Right here.
There you are.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I was wondering if you were struck by Raul Castro's warm words for you today. He said he admired you, said he had read some of your autobiographies, described you as an honest man. I'm just curious what you thought about that, and do you feel that Raul Castro is an honest man and can be trusted? And I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about another Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, who is expected to announce her campaign for the presidency tomorrow. Do you foresee being involved in her campaign, and do you hope that she runs on your record? Thank you very much.
It was a candid and fruitful conversation between me and Raul Castro. I can tell you that in the conversations I've had so far with him, two on the phone and most recently face-to-face, that we are able to speak honestly about our differences and our concerns in ways that I think offer the possibility of moving the relationship between our two countries in a different and better direction. We have very different views of how society should be organized. And I was very direct with him that we are not going to stop talking about issues like democracy and human rights and freedom of assembly and freedom of the press, not because we think we are perfect and that every country has to mimic us exactly, but because there are a set of universal principles for which we stand. And one of the goals of my administration is to have some consistency in speaking out on behalf of those who oftentimes don't have a voice. And I think during his speech in the plenary session, he was pretty clear about areas of U.S. policy he doesn't like. And I suspect he's going to continue to speak out on those. What's been clear from this entire summit, though, is the unanimity with which, regardless of their ideological predispositions, the leaders of Latin America think this is the right thing to do, because what they see is the possibility of a more constructive dialogue that ultimately benefits the Cuban people and removes what too often has been a distraction or an excuse from the hemisphere acting on important challenges that we face. So, I am cautiously optimistic that over the coming months and coming years, that the process that we've initiated, at first announced in December, reaffirmed here at the Summit of the Americas, will lead to a different future for the Cuban people and a different relationship between the United States and Cuba. With respect to Hillary Clinton, I'll make my comments very brief. She was a formidable candidate in 2008. She was a great supporter of mine in the general election. She was an outstanding Secretary of State. She is my friend. I think she would be an excellent president, and I'm not on the ballot. So, I'm not going to step on her lines when she makes a decision to announce. I'm confident that she will be very clear about her vision for the country moving forward if she announces. And, in terms of her relationship with my administration, she was focused and working on really important foreign policy initiatives. And, the one thing I can say is that she's going to be able to handle herself very well in any conversations or debates around foreign policy. And her track record with respect to domestic policy is, I think, one that cares about working families. If she decides to run and she makes an announcement, she's going to have some strong messages to deliver. Jim Avila.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Yeah.
First of all, on Cuba, if I could, two questions. The Cuban government has frequently said that it cannot allow more political or personal freedoms or press freedoms because the United States has used both covert and otherwise actions to try to overthrow the Castros. And does your new era, in fact, end regime change efforts by the United States, and should the Cubans then respond by allowing free elections and tolerance of dissent now because of the changed policy? And secondly, on the issue of Hillary Clinton, Vice President Biden, of course, said that the Democratic race is wide open. The polls seem to say otherwise. What is your opinion on that? Is the race still wide open?
Not only have I run my last election, but I am not in the business of prognosticating future elections. That is your job. And there's no shortage of people who are happy to opine on that. I will not be one of them. On Cuba, we are not in the business of regime change. We are in the business of making sure the Cuban people have freedom and the ability to participate and shape their own destiny and their own lives, and supporting civil society. And there's going to be an evolution, regardless of what we do inside of Cuba. Partly it's going to be generational. If you listen to President Castro's comments earlier this morning, a lot of the points he made referenced actions that took place before I was born. And part of my message here is the Cold War is over. There's still a whole lot of challenges that we face and a lot of issues around the world, and we're still going to have serious issues with Cuba on not just the Cuban government's approach to its own people, but also regional issues and concerns. There are going to be areas where we cooperate as well. Cuban doctors deployed during the Ebola crisis made a difference. Cuban activity in Haiti in the wake of the earthquake made a difference. And so there may be areas of collaboration as well. What I've said to President Castro is the same thing that I've said to leaders throughout the region. We have a point of view, and we won't be shy about expressing it. But I'm confident that the way to lift up the values that we care about is through persuasion. And that's going to be the primary approach that we take on a whole host of these issues, primarily because they don't implicate our national security in a direct way. And I think that we have to be very clear. Cuba is not a threat to the United States. That doesn't mean we don't have differences with it, but on the list of threats that I'm concerned about, I think it's fair to say that between ISIL and Iran getting a nuclear weapon and activities in Yemen and Libya and Boko Haram, Russian aggression in Ukraine, and the impact on our allies there. I could go down a pretty long list. Climate change, I think our approach has to be one of trying to work with the region and other countries and be very clear about what we believe and what we stand for and what we think works and what doesn't. And so often when we insert ourselves in ways that go beyond persuasion, it's counterproductive. It backfires. That's been part of our history, and which is why countries keep on trying to use us as an excuse for their own governance failures. Let's take away the excuse, and let's be clear that we're prepared to partner and engage with everybody to try to lift up opportunity and prosperity and security for people in the region. Major Garrett.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. Allow me, if you will, to quote the Supreme Leader directly.
Yes.
United States activity since the announcement of the framework has been deceptive, it is lying, it is devilish. And on two particular points, he said, direct quotes, Iran's military sites cannot be inspected under the excuse of nuclear supervision, and all sanctions should be removed when the deal is signed. Is it your opinion, Mr. President, that this is pure posturing and it should be disregarded by your government and by you and your Secretary of State? And if so, could you help me understand to whom the Supreme Leader would be posturing? Because under my limited understanding of Iranian politics, that's not a job description usually applied to the Supreme Leader.
That was a well-crafted question, Major. And let me just suggest that even a guy with the title Supreme Leader has to be concerned about his own constituencies. And the issue is not whether I have to take his word for whether that's his understanding, because we've got work until the end of June to see if we've got a document that works. And if that is his understanding and his position in ways that can't be squared with our concern about being able to embark on vigorous inspections to assure that Iran isn't cheating under any program, and that we don't have the capacity to snap back sanctions when we see a potential violation, then we're probably not going to get a deal. So, part of the concern that I have in this debate here, Major, is I don't understand why it is that everybody's working so hard to anticipate failure. The opponents of the deal don't seem to be focused on how do we get to a good deal as much as they're focused on how can we show that it's not possible to get a good deal. And my simple point is, let's wait and see what the deal is. And we'll be able to look. And if, in fact, we're not satisfied that it cuts off the pathways for Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon, then we won't sign it. If, on the other hand, it does, then I will strongly argue, and I believe the American people will support and the international community will support, that it's far preferable to the other alternatives. Now, Major, it's not going to be perfect in the sense that, if you asked Prime Minister Netanyahu or some members of the Republican caucus or even some Democrats, if you asked me, would I prefer that Iran never did have, will never have even a single nut, bolt, anything related to nuclear power, don't have any nuclear scientists, don't have any capacity to develop it, that'd be great. But that's not possible. That's not achievable. That's not achievable through sanctions. It's not achievable through military means. They're going to have some form of peaceful nuclear power, and that will then pose a challenge for the international community, which is why the political agreement calls for unprecedented framework of inspections that allows us to assure that it's not being used or diverted in ways that could be weaponized. But we're going to have to see whether or not we can get a deal or not. My own